is the future? The simple answer is anything after the present. Yet the present is always changing. Therefore, so is the future. The future undoubtedly has characteristics. It has styles, sounds, temperatures, colors and color schemes, types of people and types of societies. The future is an abstraction of what the present moment predicts it will become. The important thing to remember is the future hasn't happened yet. It will never happen. It is always in a state of non-existence. In a way, whatever the present moment decides to make of the future is what the future becomes. The future of today's world looks very different than the future of last decade or the decade before that or the decade before that. Art has always mimicked the views and opinions of its time. Even art that is hailed as ahead of its time is still a product of its time. When art depicts the future, it will inevitably manifest the attitudes of the time it was made in and project them onto the future. Whether that be one of radical technocracy, equality for all people, or exploration of space in the universe. The future is an ongoing project that ultimately represents the desires and wishes of people and societies throughout history. Futurism is an artistic movement. Starting around the beginning of the 20th century, it was catalyzed by the fast-changing technology and growing interconnectedness of the world. Filippo Tommaso Marinetti published a Manifesto of Futurism in 1909. Marinetti was an Italian artist. He also fought in World War I, which most likely had led him deeper into the futurist hole due to the exposure of state-of-the-art military technology and a repudiation of the contemporary global order that led to such a horrific war. Futurism, at its inception, was about the rejection of tradition and the intentional push by young people to forward humanity. Marinetti was joined by other Italian artists in the promotion of Futurism to make the Italian Futurist movement. Marinetti's manifesto details the goals and aspirations of the Futurist movement. It begins with poetic meditations on technology and the contemporary world. Marinetti then lists 11 points in the manifesto, which are a summation of the philosophy. At one point, when he's lamenting on the past, he says, "Museums, cemeteries, truly identical in their sinister juxtaposition of bodies that do not know each other. Public dormitories where you sleep side by side forever with beings you hate or do not know. Reciprocal ferocity of the painters and sculptors who murder each other in the same museum with blows of line and color." This is just the beginning of his distaste for the glorification of the past. He believed it was up to the youth to push humanity forward into the future, and to do so, they must dispose of the past. The Futurists were big supporters of industrialization. Humans have been living a certain way of life for a while. Since the first agricultural revolution, humans have been living on, working on, and dying on the same farms for thousands of years. Now, humans are living in cities. They can travel across the world quickly. They can choose to do whatever they want to do since technology enables less intensive and less time-consuming labor. Futurists had a particular interest in movement as a concept. The idea that movement can happen at rapid speeds was extremely fascinating and inspirational. When the locomotive was invented, humans were traveling at speeds faster than ever before. The invention of the automobile and the airplane contributed to this fast-moving evolution. Many Italian futurists, including Marinetti, eventually joined the Italian National Fascist Party. This ties the origins of futurism to the origins of fascism, which also began in Italy with Benito Mussolini. Marinetti writes of his anti-feminist and pro-war sentiments in the Manifesto of Futurism. "We want to glorify war, the only cure for the world. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill and contempt for women. We want to demolish museums and libraries, fight morality, feminism, and all opportunist and utilitarian cowardice." Although the origins of futurism are bound to fascism, the movement grew and expanded beyond that, and in many ways has been used to counter the sentiment that Marinetti clamors about in his manifesto. The Russians had their own school of futurism, inspired by the Italian futurists. The Russian iteration of futurism was less idealist than its Italian counterpart. It mainly pushed forward new artistic forms and methods, such as experimental literature and painting. The rapid Russian ascension from a feudal and agrarian society to a modern and industrial one at the turn of the century inspired the Russian Futurists. Rather than rejecting the past as the Italians did, they embraced it and used it to project their visions for the future. Getting thirsty. There were many Russian Futurists who pioneered the movement, not only in their country but worldwide. The foremost Russian futurist had to be Mayakovsky. He wrote his own Futurism manifesto titled A Slap in the Face of Public Taste, which kind of goes hard for a manifesto title, in 1913. His poetry and art were some of the most well-known of the Russian futurists. Rather than calling himself a futurist, he and his ideological peers would be labeled as such by the press. Much of his writings were anti-war and anti-bourgeois, because Russia in the beginning of the 20th century. Other prominent Russian futurists include Kazimir Malevich and Natalia Goncharova. Malevich wrote plays and painted. He was inspired by Cubism, an artistic movement which is commonly associated with Pablo Picasso. Both the Futurist and Cubist movements evolved alongside and in part because of each other. To quickly summarize their connection, Cubism attempts to create three-dimensional shapes and sounds on a two-dimensional plane, which presents more texture and angular perception for the audience. This allows objects in motion to be rendered in a more understandable way. Goncharova worked with Khlebnikov, another premier Russian futurist, on illustrated poetry books. Illustration with writing wasn't really done before, so their work pioneered the basic idea of the children's book, which we know and appreciate today. Goncharova also worked on avant-garde ballets during her lifetime. Although she switched around different artistic movements like Cubism and Rayonism, her eclectic artistry led contemporaries to dub her style as everythingism. Her prominence as an artist who embraced futurism gave way for increased awareness of the movement. In the early days of futurism, among the cohort of artists taking up space in the emerging movement, there were musicians. It's apt to start with Francesco Pratella, who himself wrote yet another manifesto. This particular manifesto was the Manifesto of Futurist Musicians. It's no slap in the face of public taste, but I guess it'll do. The manifesto calls for a complete breakdown of the contemporary structures and institutions around music. Pratella calls for young composers to desert schools, conservatories, and musical academies, and to consider free study as the only means of regeneration, and the liberation of individual musical sensibility from all imitation or influence of the past, feeling and singing with the future, drawing inspiration from nature through all the human and extra-human phenomena present in it. It appears as though Pratella is against the consolidation of knowledge and power. However, this manifesto is riddled with nationalistic fervor and pro-fascist sentiment. Let us now take a look at Pratella's music. In accordance with his fascist and militaristic beliefs, he wrote a piece emulating a battle. This excerpt is from La Battaglia por Piano. This piece is tumultuous. The aggressive strikes against the piano instill terror into the tone. Movement can be heard within the piece. There is an emphasis on the cyclical feature of the music. This could perhaps be the novel machinery used in World War I, as these sounds wouldn't necessarily accurately portray war in the pre-industrial age. Another early futurist musician is Luigi Russolo. Russolo was one of the early adopters of what we now call noise music. Russolo had a sort of spiritual view of music, which is reinforced by his futurist beliefs. What he did was build his own instruments out of random mechanical parts, learn them, and create pieces using them. This determination was reinforced by the idea that he was manifesting the spirits using mechanisms and his music. This idea goes back to the futurist notion that new technologies were allowing humanity to contact other planes of reality. Russolo's noise music sounded like this. Music sounds like machinery, and in a very real sense, that's what it is. Russolo is making noises based on movement and speed. The first excerpt sounds like an engine or automobile. Russolo wanted to take these never-before-heard sounds, which were becoming commonplace because of the new technology, and manipulate them to make music. To add on to this, Russolo also wrote his own manifesto, The Art of Noise. Not bad. This manifesto was directly in response, actually, to Pertella's manifesto. He expresses that noise was not really born before the 19th century with the advent of machinery. Today, noise reigns supreme over human sensibility. He discusses the spiritual and religious elements that music has served over the course of human history. In fact, he asserted that all music ought to adopt these new noises, as he believed that natural sound would fail to arouse any emotions, quote unquote. Perhaps most importantly, he claimed that noise sounds come in infinite variety, while pure sounds, or natural sounds, create a restrictive cycle. Turning to the Russian futurists now, the composer Alexander Mosolov dabbled in industrial sound as well. However, his was different from Russolo's. Rather than using machines to make the noises, he used orchestras to mimic the noises of machines. His work, The Iron Foundry, was an imitation of a factory. This is a part of that piece. The instrumentation in the Iron Foundry is expanding. It grows and roars and chugs like the mechanisms of a factory. These sounds, made from typical orchestral instruments, transport the listener into an industrial age forge. Another Russian futurist musician at the time was Mikhail Matyusin. He created many different forms of art and didn't necessarily focus much on music. He worked in an opera with Kazimir Malevich titled Victory Over the Sun. Matyushin wrote the music for the piece. This was the first futurist opera ever made, and perhaps the most famous. It is extremely modernist and includes abstract and sometimes nonsensical plot points. Essentially, the opera is about a group of revolutionaries who, with the help of technology, successfully execute a plan to take over the sun. This is a clip of the opera performed in 2015 at the Theater Basel in Switzerland with music playing. The music, along with the acting, depicts a mechanistic scene. In this scene, as well as throughout the opera, the line between humans and machines blur, as the humans appear to play as part of the mechanisms. The early futurist musicians toyed with the idea of machinery, noise, and movement. These works were the product of a young movement, still expanding its horizons and understanding what it is and what it could be. Without the groundwork laid down by these artists, the movement wouldn't ever have an impact on the soundscape. Electronic music may seem like a relatively new genre. I mean, electronics were made in the last few decades, right? Well, not exactly. The very invention of recorded music changed the way music was composed and made. The science of acoustics needed to be rethought, and the settings in which people chose to listen to music completely exploded. The telegraphone, yes, that's what it's called, invented by Valdemar Poulsen in 1898, was one of the first electronic instruments ever made. Sounds could now be recorded and mixed together. This paved the way for artists like Russolo to create the music he made. The theremin, invented by Leon Theremin in 1928, was an early electronic instrument that was able to be played without any strings or physical contact. According to Shapiro and Lee, the instrument was the prototype for the early synthesizers such as the Moog. It's impossible to discuss early electronic music without mentioning the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. Created by the BBC in 1958, its original purpose was to provide theme tunes, incidental music, and effects for programs. According to Delia Derbyshire, one of the most famous members of the workshop, they spent quite a lot of time trying to invent new sounds. Derbyshire actually was responsible for arranging the theme to the popular show Doctor Who. She, as well as the other members of the workshop, created the futuristic sound effects which can be heard in the show.
If the sound we want exists already in real life, say, we couldn't go and record it. We can get the lower sounds we need from the rhythm by slowing down the tape. And the higher sounds by speeding up the tape. And then all we have to do is cut the notes the right length. We can join them together on a loop and listen to them.
Derbyshire made music out of everyday sounds, in the way Russolo dreamed. In a way, she manifested Russolo's vision better than himself. Rather than creating her own instruments to mimic everyday noises, she used everyday noises to orchestrate symphonies of pure, original sound. She even discusses the sounds of the city herself.
Well, I remember it myself. The sound of clogs on cobbles. You know, people going to the mill at 6 o'clock in the morning or something. That must be such an influence on me.
Derbyshire also made an album called Electrosonic, where she creatively used peculiar and unique sounds to make music for the sake of making music rather than the BBC television shows. This piece is called Computermatic. This type of noise music is known as musique concrète. Daphne Rem is considered one of the pioneers of musique concrète, not only because she co-founded the Radiophonic Workshop, but because of the solo compositions she made after leaving due to gender discrimination on behalf of the BBC. She also invented the Oremix machine, which gave people the opportunity to literally draw music. This is one example of Orem's musical work. Not straying too far from Russolo's own mysticism, Orem developed her own metaphysical theories regarding the nature of sounds and vibrations and their relations to atoms and molecules. She believed that humans are instruments. She wrote in her manifesto titled An Individual Note of Music, Sound and Electronics, humans feature a whole spectrum of resonant frequencies which are never at rest, never in a steady state, but are vibrant with pulsating tension. While the members of the Radiophonic Workshop were merely considered to be technicians by the BBC, which in fact they were, their creativity and influence expanded so far that no one can deny them the title of composer. Their work was only the beginning of electronic music's fusion with the science fiction genre. Enter Bibi and Louis Bacon. They were a couple who both together made electronic music. In 1956, they made the first electronic film soundtrack for the movie Forbidden Planet. It was a sci-fi movie, if you can't tell. Unfortunately, again, these early electronic artists did not receive credit for their work, as their contributions were minimized as electronic tonalities. What does that even mean? Rather than musical score. Despite not being recognized for their brilliance in electronic music's avant-garde era, these early musicians made their mark with exceptionally strange sounds, complex philosophies, technically wondrous inventions, and contributions to popular culture's most beloved works. In the late 60s and early 70s, it's hard to track the different musical styles I'll be talking about because there are so many different artists around this period who influenced each other using the same techniques and inspirations. The fact is, there were so many artists making music at the same time, and they all borrowed from each other. Since it is very much a boom of electronic music, there isn't a clear distinction through the chain of influences. So I might be jumping around a fair amount while discussing this period. After those humble beginnings, electronic music takes off. But before that, there came the invention of the synthesizer. Robert Moog was the man responsible for the synthesizer. Similarly to the composers of the Radiophonic Workshop, Robert Moog was a sound technician. He said in an interview, "I think sound was the most appealing part of being in electronics. It was a visceral pleasure for me to hear all these things coming out of the loudspeaker." The first album made entirely using the Moog was by Wendy Carlos, titled Switched on Bach. This project was revolutionary for its time and inspired many different uses for the Moog. Many of these other switched on albums had futuristic album covers. The idea that using the synthesizer was a sort of futurization of existing music took root. Perhaps because the instrument made abstract sounds that people associated with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, or because the instrument was literally a newfangled piece of technology. Other companies began manufacturing the synthesizer, and many popular artists like the Beatles and the Doors began to use it, especially during the psychedelic movement. One artist, Giorgio Moroder, became known for his initial adoption of the synthesizer and his experimentation with it. In an interview with the French duo Daft Punk, he said that in the 70s he believed that the synthesizer was the sound of the future, quote unquote. Moroder won many awards throughout his life, including Grammys, Oscars, and Golden Globes. Nowadays, he works on computer art, continuing the tradition of artistic experimentation with future technology. He's known as the father of disco and has been a large influence on disco culture as a whole. He became synonymous with an electronic futuristic sound. He was able to define the movement before it even began. Moroder will be a key figure later on with the height and eventual evolution of disco in the late 70s. The sound of the future was the name of the game for disco, and the culture reflected that in a myriad of ways, from film to fashion to philosophy. At around the same time, artists like Jimi Hendrix and David Bowie began adopting science fiction into their music and mythos. They would write miniature sci-fi stories into their songs, like Third Stone from the Sun or Space Oddity, and use electronic instruments like the synthesizer to create unique sounds. David Bowie in particular was fascinated with science fiction and space. He incorporated sci-fi motifs and themes into his music, perhaps most notably on the song Space Oddity, which itself was inspired by Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. One of Bowie's most critically acclaimed works, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, is an adoption of his alter ego Ziggy Stardust, who is not only a science fiction in name, but in concept. In an interview, Bowie describes the story of the album and character. Ziggy is advised in a dream by the infinites to write the coming of a starman, so he writes Starman, which is the first news of hope that the people have heard, so they latch onto it immediately. The starmen that he is talking about are called the infinites, and they are black hole jumpers. Ziggy has been talking about this amazing spaceman who will be coming down to save Earth. They arrive somewhere in Greenwich Village. They don't have a care in the world and are of no possible use to us. They just happen to stumble into our universe by black hole jumping. Their whole life is traveling from universe to universe. Another example of space rock is Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. There's a great deal of experimentation and synthesizer use throughout the album. It adopted electronic instrumentation early on with its production. The enormous success of this album opened the door to new possibilities with psychedelia, techno, and rock. The influence of space on rock and roll is much more expansive than what is outlined here. Bowie leads us in a very interesting area of futurism. The idea of alienation within youth culture reached a supercharged point around this time. Not only were new and different sounding styles ostracized, but so were marginalized groups. It was often the case that these groups would adopt a new style of music in a way of expressing their otherness and nonconformist identity. Enter Afrofuturism.
Well, all right. Star Child, citizens of the universe, recording angels. We have returned to claim the pyramids. Partying on the mothership. I am the mothership connection.
I'm sure you've heard the term Afrofuturism before. It gets used a lot when discussing more contemporary art. Well, as it turns out, Afrofuturism actually started out in the 1950s with a man who went by the name of Sun Ra. Sun Ra was from the south side of Chicago, but he hailed himself from the planet Saturn. To say that Sun Ra was a jazz musician would be an understatement. He was a poet, philosopher, mystic, and activist, alongside being a genre-bending musician. He devised a way of seeing his own black identity alongside the infinite vastness and possibility of the future. Sun Ra embraced Egyptian astronomy. He literally named himself after the Egyptian sun god, and used it as a vehicle to elevate his role in society. Rather than being an outsider, he became a prophet. He claimed to be visiting planet Earth to promote peace and love. He was knowledgeable on the history of language and critically deconstructed the words that we commonly use, especially those that appear similarly in the Bible, and was also an early adopter of the synthesizer. Sun Ra had many writings. The Wisdom of Sun Ra is a collection of some of them. The contents in this book can be a little reminiscent of some of Kanye West's tweets, interestingly enough. Though a notable excerpt from this work, What America Should Consider, stood out as fundamentally futurist. The civilizations of the past have been used as the foundations of the civilization of today. Because of this, the world keeps looking toward the past for guidance. Too many people are following the past. The past is dead, and those who are following the past are doomed to die and be like the past. It is not an accident that those who die are said to have passed, since those who have passed are past. It's important to keep in mind the term Afrofuturism wasn't coined until decades later. In fact, Sun Ra would have actually died a year before the first major publication would ever use the word. Yet this passage reads very futurist, and not in a mid-20th century or Ram sort of way, but in a politically charged Marinetti sort of way. Despite this, instead of using the future as an opportunity to declare fascistic supremacy, Sun Ra uses the future as an opportunity to morph into a new identity for himself and his art. His works are racially driven. He reconciles the immovable disposition he finds himself in with his own creativity and artistic interest to create an idealized version of what his identity could be. Once he fully embodies that, he effectively changes his identity. I mean, after all, no one really refers to him by his birth name, Herman Poole Blount. In a way, his philosophy is reminiscent of the Russian futurists. He used futurism as a way to project a synthesized version of their esteemed past and their utopian aspirations onto the future. A place where anything is possible. John Corbett, who compiled the works comprising the Wisdom of Sun Ra, spoke of Sun Ra's innovativeness. The mind, and more specifically the reasonable mind, is configured as a terrestrial zone, as Earth. Sanity is the ground from which one departs in flights of fancy. Hence, the connection is established between going way out, a common phrase in jazz for a solo that transgresses as a widely held musical code, and leaving Earth. Tradition equals Earth. Innovation equals outer space. In the language of black music, madness and extraterrestriality go hand in hand. However, these are all abstractions of a proto-Afrofuturism that will eventually arise out of nourishment by other artists. Psychedelic seeped its way into the Black Power movement and gave birth to sister bands Funkadelic and Parliament. Both of these bands were headed by George Clinton, an early Afrofuturists. As opposed to Sun Ra, whose music primarily fell under the category of experimental jazz, Clinton's music is pure funk. It's important to note right off the bat how influential Clinton's music has become, especially in the development of hip-hop music and culture. By 1997, P-Funk, the name of the musical collective together, Parliament and Funkadelic, was the second most sampled artist in history under James Brown. Their aesthetic, like Sun Ra's, borrowed from Egyptian mythology and projected it forward into the cosmic realm. In a 2016 interview with Vice, George Clinton says of his inspiration of the future, "Back in 1968, 2001: A Space Odyssey came out, and Fantasia. I saw both of them. I'm thinking, when the guy is talking to his wife on FaceTime or Skype, I'm going to be there when that happens. And then to be here today and to see it, all the FaceTime, the iPhones, and social media, the future is here now." P-Funk embraced the idea of a black future. In doing so, they created Black Future. The eventual development of hip-hop and today's music in general is a product of the sonic and aesthetic groundwork laid by the group. P-Funk came out with Mothership Connection in 1975, which cemented Futurism into their legacy. The album begins with,
"A good evening. Do not attempt to adjust your radio. There is nothing wrong. We have taken control as to bring you this special show. We will return it to you as soon as you are grooving. Welcome to station WEFUNK, better known as We Funk, or deeper still, the Mothership Connection, home of the extraterrestrial brothers, dealers of funky music, P-Funk, Uncut Funk, the bomb.
Coming to you directly from the mothership. Top of the chocolate Milky Way. 500,000 kilowatts of P-Funk power."
The language that is used here suggests a future taken over by black style and culture. They are extraterrestrials who are in control. Language and sentiments such as these are found scattered throughout Mothership Connection. During live shows, the band even showcased the spaceship that they themselves built, which a replica of now exists and sits in the Smithsonian African American Museum. The funk band Earth, Wind & Fire also made their mark on the early Afrofuturist soundscape. Like the other two artists mentioned, their aesthetic borrowed from Egyptian mythology. Alongside this, they also borrowed from African fashion and clothing styles. Their album covers often depicted surrealist Afrofuturist scenes. They forwarded the funk scene in their own way, and their music, as well as that of P-Funks, heavily used the synthesizer to cultivate their futuristic decrees. Just listen to the song Moonwalk by Earth, Wind & Fire. By this point, the future was baked into the synthesizer, and the synthesizer was baked into the future. Disco took the synthesizer to new heights. If funk had popular music dipping its toes in the synthesizer, then with disco it was jumping straight into the action. Disco was more than just a genre of music. It was a culture. Entering a discotheque in the 70s was a vastly different experience than entering any nightclub today. For one, the conventions and stereotypes about nightclubs today were birthed with the disco movement. The drug-induced, sexually liberated, disorienting extravaganza began with the movement. Back in the 70s, when you entered a disco, you entered another world. A future world. A future where you weren't judged on your race, sexual orientation, gender identity, or even your thoughts and opinions. You only had one job to do. Dance. You entered a future with electronic music, dynamic lights, and dance styles no one in the outside world knew about. Even the fundamental crown of the nightclub, the disco ball, upheld this notion of the future. It's always evolving, reflecting the people around it, all while entrancing the eye. According to dance historian Richard Powers, disco was a way to be modern. Beyond modern. It was futuristic, a major element of the disco scene. Everything was state-of-the-art, from the latest look and club design to all new fashions and all new synthetic polyester fabrics. Disco went mainstream with the release of the movie Saturday Night Fever. This movie is perhaps the most famous disco movie ever made. It widely popularized and romanticized the discotheque, creating a boom in disco culture and nightlife. Though disco disappeared in an explosion at the end of the 70s in the United States, electronic music continued to evolve. High energy is a style of music that saw the electronic aspects of disco taken to the extreme. High Energy contained the robotic futurism that dancers enjoyed in disco, while retaining the dreamlike feeling of absolute freedom. The synthesizer was used much more in high energy compositions relative to their traditional disco counterparts. The music was almost purely electronic. The tempo was faster, it sounded more mechanical, it meant business. In a sense, it was practical. It was the perfect combination that allowed for complete escapism of minority groups like queer, black, and Latino individuals at the time, as well as, or perhaps especially of, the intersections between them. These minority groups felt a sort of transcendence and spiritual freedom that the world failed to offer them outside the disco. In the club, they could be who they truly were. Everyone's an outcast. You're all there to dance, and no one will remember you tomorrow. There was a unity among all the dancers at the disco. Music brought everyone together in a way that literally nothing else in life did. One dancer of the disco described their experience as, every person in the club, black, white, Latin, straight, or gay, was experiencing and feeling the exact same thing. All of us together, as spiritual human beings that transcended gender and race. Music was the answer and love was the message. This idea of a genderless and raceless future was important. It is a cornerstone in the advancement of futurism. Without minorities adopting their vision for a better future through culture and music, it's hard to believe that futurism would have continued to develop beyond a mere aesthetic. It became much more than it was before. It became a voice for the unheard, an outlet for the outcast, and a warm hug for the cold and neglected souls of various communities. Futurism is hopeful. It gives marginalized individuals a home for their desires and dreams. Queerness in particular found a home in discotheques. The very existence of queerness breaks down existing societal structures. Dr. Diana Minkowski writes of the sexual liberty inherent in disco. Disco offered a space in which an array of gender and sexual identities were possible. A space in which the social world of heterosexual masculine aggression and female sexual passivity could be reimagined to also include practices such as homosexuality, androgyny, and female sexual agency within a music that itself mixed cultural influences such as black R&B, Latin rhythms, and orchestral strings. It is difficult to live in a heteronormative world when your mere existence disrupts the order of that world. It breaks the dichotomies which have been created and established centuries ago. A rejection of this rigid past paves the way for a fluid future. A future where there are no arbitrary classifications of identity and individuals are free to live the life they please. This queer utopianism manifested itself in the futuristic aesthetic of discos. The futurism that sprouted in discos captivated the dreams of dancers. They wanted a world without barriers, where people could socially and spiritually transcend the difficulties imposed by contemporary society. A world where strangers could dance with each other and feel that connection. Disco fashion also reinforced this idea. Many of the fashion styles adopted by disco dancers were futuristic in their aesthetic. Although many heterosexual men shied away from the androgynous futuristic style, other demographics did not. Regardless of what we may think of these styles today, at their time, it was seen as groundbreaking and different. Kraftwerk is an electronic group that began making music toward the end of the 60s. They were pioneers in electronic instrumentation. They made their sonic mark with their 1974 album Autobahn, an ode to the German National Highway System. The album, according to guitarist Ralf Hutter, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is a continuation of the early futurism. This album mimics the experience of driving along the highway. This emphasis on movement is a direct callback to the inspirations that started futurist thought decades before. Autobahn was hugely influential in the development of synthpop and opened the soundscape to new opportunities. It was fresh, it was unique, and it was the future. Also in the sphere of synthpop was Space. Space was a band, primarily active in the 70s and 80s, which made electronic music. Their music was disco-inspired, yet also ventured into more of an early techno sound. It isn't hard to see how their music was futurist. The Final Frontier played heavily into their aesthetic, and it was clear that their sound was made to explore the sonically unknown. Their music was futuristically exotic. Without words, it told of faraway lands which would soon be explored by a budding human space civilization. The invention of the synthesizer completely changed the course of music, as the invention of recorded music did before. Both inventions allowed for new experimentation styles, genres, and cultures. A plethora of artists living in the dawn of the space age, inspired by science fiction, set out to express their dreams of a future in space. Individuals like David Bowie and George Clinton were not only fascinated by the ongoing discovery of space, but they cultivated the public's perceptions of what space was and could be. If it weren't for such artists, we probably wouldn't have this peaceful, post-human, civilized, intergalactic view of our future in space. All this, propelled by black and queer artists and dancers, changed not only the contemporary futurism, but the future itself. Do we live in the future? Well, I mean, not exactly. We live in the present. As I keep saying, we're constantly constructing the future. There's no way to actually reach it, you know? Despite this, with the incredibly imaginative technology that we seamlessly interact with in our daily lives, it feels like we live in an age separate from the ones that came before. The possibilities of what humanity can achieve feel almost unreal, yet they are still possibilities. Human technological advancement has reached a point where things change so fast that eras become generations, generations become decades, decades become years. The childhoods of people over 60 are vastly different than childhoods today. Yet looking throughout the entirety of human history, people have dwelled in the same land that their families lived in for generations. Now things are changing. We have a new digital realm to explore. We have vehicles that travel so fast they would give Marinetti a heart attack if he ever rode one. The conceptions of the future that, people had many years ago imagined of have manifested itself in our contemporary world. I'd like to quickly mention the connection between metal and sci-fi. While not necessarily originating in the 21st century, there's a deep connection running underneath metal, the Bible, and the future. The imagery of apocalypse or Armageddon is common in many metal records. Perhaps it is tied to the hope of starting new in the wake of terrible human atrocities and sin. Metal's interest in space makes a lot of sense. Space is empty, dark, and cold. It is a theater for creation and destruction. It is infinitely complex, yet so peacefully simple. Arjun Lucassen, the band behind the metal project Ayreon, has a 2016 project called Universal Migrator, an operatic sci-fi composition. This is a fragment of the 10-minute epic Into the Black Hole. Here, Lucassen uses the synthesizer to first establish a sense of desolation and then mutates it into a feeling of cosmic horror. This is just one example of futurism in metal, which has a longer history and dates back to the beginnings of space rock mentioned earlier. Kicking open the door of the 21st century was Daft Punk's Discovered. Very much a play on the word disco. Discovery, as the title suggests, is a venture into something new, something uncharted. Made by two robot-looking individuals, the album sonically explores technology and space. The artists are almost unreal. They don't show their face. They mask their voice behind autotune, and they exploded in popularity alongside the internet. It's almost like they came from the internet. Songs like Digital Love, Voyager, and Short Circuit all convey this feeling of technological infusion with music. Daft Punk blurs the line between making electronic music and living in an electronic lifestyle. This is helped by the increasing rate at which digital technology was entering human life in 2001. As opposed to P-Funk, who are aliens coming in from outer space, D-Punk were aliens coming from cyberspace. Discovery uploaded techno music to a much larger audience, marking the beginning of a new century for futurism, music, and humanity. Daft Punk's 2013 record, Random Access Memories, was a large undertaking. Many big names are featured here. Pharrell Williams, Nile Rodgers, Giorgio Moroder, Paul Williams. As the title suggests, they're revitalizing older electronic music and disco acts for the digital age. The world today is more electronic, more futuristic, more technological than the one Giorgio Moroder and Paul Williams came up in. Their music called ahead to Daft Punk's time, and Random Access Memories is Daft Punk calling back. The concept of futurism intertwining with the past is something we've seen before with the Russian futurists and Afrofuturism. In the context of building a more socially equitable future, this makes sense. It reasserts a dominance that was lost in order to remind people of what could have been, or what still could be. Daft Punk does that in this record. And more recently, Dua Lipa has done something similar with her aptly named Future Nostalgia. Here we can see Lipa making an allusion to Physical by Olivia Newton-John, the 1981 smash hit. Not only does she do this with the title and lyrics, but even the bass line has a similar progression. Lipa is creating the feeling of nostalgia within her song, all the while interspersing futuristic concepts throughout. She says lyrics, "Nothing on this planet compares to it," and "Love the simulation we're dreaming in." These lyrics may seem out of place on a 1981 record, especially the simulation one, yet in the context of Lipa's aesthetic and time period, it's a perfect fit. Creative stylist for Doja Cat, Brett Allen Nelson, says, "You're never going to be able to really create futurism unless you're able to do a hodgepodge mix of things. Because if you really think about it, even today, people dress from all different eras. That's really what our future is. People are always going to be inspired by the past." While all these other music genres are important for discussing futurism in the 21st century, the defining genre of our time has yet to be addressed: hip-hop.
Gotta get that. Gotta get that. Gotta get that. Gotta get that. Boom, boom, boom. 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 That boom, boom, boom. That boom, boom, boom. Boom, boom. Yo, I got that hit to beat the block. You can get that bass on below. I got that rock and roll, that future flow, that digital spit, next level visual. I got that boom, boom, boom. How to beat bang.
I like that boom, boom, pow. Them chickens jacking my style. They try to copy my swagger. I'm on that next now. I'm sold 3008. You sold 2000 and late. I got that boom, boom, boom. That future boom, boom, boom. Let me get in that.
It's easy to hear the Daft Punk inspiration on Boom Boom Pow. Just listen to One More Time on Discovery. Both songs were club hits in a newly digital age, taking advantage of both the high and low registers of autotune with unstoppable dance rhythms. People wanted to hear music they could connect to. In an increasingly electronic world, the music had to become electronic. From the computerized bass line to the autotune vocals to the futuristic lyrics, the sound was on one hand familiar and on the other a valiant leap into something state-of-the-art. Again, the ideas of the future were a reflection of the times they were conceived in. These artists were speaking from a digital future, one that people saw just over the horizon. Even the album cover is a digital rendering of the combined faces of the four band members. I'ma Be was an affirmation of a positive future. Lead artist will.i.am has embraced the future throughout his career. His song Reach for the Stars was transmitted from the Mars Curiosity rover back to Earth, being the first song in history being from another planet. Black Eyed Peas released an augmented reality book in 2018. Yes, you heard that right. With the help of Marvel, Hans Zimmer, and many hip-hop legends like Snoop Dogg, Mary J. Blige, and Rakim. Again, the END was a step into the future for music. It inspired great hits entering the 2010s like Starships and Party Rock Anthem. Even the use of autotune was popularized by this album. However, the use of autotune in hip-hop owes credit to one man.
In the night, I hear him talk, the coldest story ever told. Somewhere far along this road, he lost his soul to a woman so heartless. How could you be so heartless? Oh, how could you be so heartless?
Kanye West is a self-described futurist. In many of his interviews, he passionately talks about his plans and visions for the future. In his music, he pushes common boundaries. Aside from his 2008 record 808s and Heartbreak, where he adopted an electronic sound to exhibit emotions of depression and numbness, on his 2013 record Yeezus, he was playing a whole different sport of experimentation. This is just the beginning of the first song on Yeezus. The rest of the album continues this noisy machinist abstraction for 40 minutes with some lyrics along for the ride. This, of course, is reminiscent of Rusolo and Son of Derbyshire work. It is born out of new technology and advancements in music composition, as well as the artistic desire to form original connections and styles. He's stretching. Kanye West is also inspired by Cubism, as the title of his 2016 album, The Life of Pablo, suggests. As I stated before, the Cubist movement grew directly out of the Futurist movement.
Hands up, we just doing what the cops told us. Hands up, we just doing what the cops told us. I've been out of my mind a long time. I've been out of my mind a long time. I be saying how I feel at the wrong time. Might not come when you want, but I'm on time.
As you can hear on this track, West continues, albeit in a more subtle way, in the industrial noise instrumentation. Kanye West music has spawned many new sounds and styles in hip-hop, like Travis Scott for example. But we can't talk about Futurist Kanye West proteges without talking about Future. Future is a hip-hop artist. His real name is Navadius Demon Wilburn, and for the sake of clarity, I'm going to refer to him as Wilburn. Wilburn took after Kanye West and Black Eyed Peas with the auto-tune rapping, but he made it a core part of his persona. Wilburn adopted a trap sound in the beginning of his career, with the first 3 albums titled Astronaut Status, Pluto, and Pluto 3D. Pretty clear that Wilburn had some interest in outer space. It's after his first album where he begins to use autotune, but if we fast forward to 2017, we can see some real electronic influence in Wilburn's music.
You better not raise your voice at me. You know I got a pimp to yeah, put up. Draco season with the book bag. Rat tag got a little kickback. Hunters on hunters got a good batch. You ain't never ever get your bitch back.
This was on his self-titled 2017 album. It's interesting to see this mesh of techno trap as early as 2017. Perhaps what's most futuristic about Wilburn's music is his use of autotune. It's a distortion of the voice. This is reminiscent of Jimi Hendrix's use of distortion with his guitar, which was also a way to represent, spacey, sci-fi, futuristic sounds. Perhaps this is part of why he calls himself Future Hendrix in some contexts. While all these hip-hop artists incorporate Afrofuturism into their music, we need to talk about the premier Afrofuturist artist today, Janelle Monáe. Cultural theorist Caldwell Eshin describes Afrofuturism as such. Afro-diasporic subjects live the estrangement that science fiction writers envision. Black existence and science fiction are one and the same. Janelle Monáe embraces science fiction tropes with her fashion, music, and even her new book, The Memory Librarian. Monáe specifically intersects blackness and femininity using futurism. She does so by bending gender in her performances in such a way that overwrite female-male dichotomies. The song that perhaps best represents this is her 2013 song Electric Lady.
Electric lady, yeah, I'll reprogram your mind. Come on, get in. My spaceship leaves at 10. Oh, I'm where I wanna be, just you and me. Baby, talking on the side as the world spins around.
These lyrics illustrate feminine control and independence. The lyrics, "My spaceship leaves at 10, conveys this sense of autonomy. It's like saying, I'm gonna shoot for the stars with or without you, so you better decide. Doja Cat created a feminist, futuristic world on her most recent album, Planet Her. The record and aesthetics is heavily influenced by sci-fi motifs. The music videos alongside this album feature Doja Cat as a divine feminine alien, as she says on the song Woman. Her fashion style for the album was made to embody this aesthetic. Planet Her constructs the idea of a feminine futurism. Music videos feature a planet which is consecrated with feminine energy, inhabited entirely by women. This feminine utopia that Doja Cat offers us sees her able to mystify and control men, and live as she pleases. She manages to entrance multiple men throughout the series of music videos, and also leads armies of women. She depicts herself as a sort of messianic figure at points, and uses spiritual imagery on the song Woman.
Baby, worship my hips and waist. So feminine with grace. I touch your soul when you hear me say, boy, let me be a woman.
The CG world that was created was actually done using Unreal Engine 5, which is a program that video game companies use. This can perhaps open new doors for music videos and visual albums. Could we see an album be released in the form of a video game? will.i.am seems to think so, and he's released an augmented reality book with its own soundtrack. This boundary-pushing innovation is perhaps the next step in futurist music. The future is never a fixed point. It is always changing. The future is merely humanity's imagination running wild, sometimes letting go of any attachment to the present. Futurist musicians created what they saw in their dreams and manifesting those dreams into the collective reality. Futurism is deciding where to place the next step in the long march of humanity. The future is what things could be if only humanity had the patience or the technology or the bravery. Yet the very existence of these futurist visions proves that humanity does have those requirements. Futurism did not develop in a vacuum. It was born out of an increasingly industrialized world that didn't seem to compromise on its innovation. One year is the telegraph, the next is the automobile, the next is the gramophone, the next is the synthesizer, and the next is the internet. Humanity has grown playing with the toys of technology. It's a fact of life. Futurism is the intersection between the two most human things, technology and imagination. Futurists did their best to realize their imagination. They dared to make things that looked and sounded weird. Yet, the future is weird. It's never ordinary, because if it was, then it would simply be the present. We cannot predict the things that are yet to happen. Delia Derbyshire didn't know she was creating a strong association between sci-fi and musique concrète. Robert Moog didn't know his sonic machine would change the course of music history. Sun Ra didn't know he was apprehending the beginning traces of Afrofuturism. Yet these individuals, with their respective creativity and drive, managed to influence our experiences today. All these artists that we've looked at may not have known that they were making history, but they knew that they were creating the future.